Hi y'all, I'm Anis Mojgani. Greetings from my home to yours. I hope y'all are out there keeping safe, practicing social distancing, wearing your masks in peopled spaces, and overall doing good amongst the quarantine. And for any of those days that may be particularly hard, I hope you're being easy with yourself. This is the first time we're all doing what we're doing. I wish I could be doing Verselandia with everyone right now, but I am happy to be part of Virtualandia, and today I was going to share with y'all some of my philosophies and process regarding performance. I've got 5 things I wanted to talk to you about, as well as a little batch of kind of more technical tidbits to share, so let's get to it. Number 1, a well-written poem. That might seem apparent, but it is definitely a very, very important thing. I remember the poet Patricia Smith, hearing her say how 90% of the work for performing on stage is done in the writing of the poem, and I completely agree. You know, a good poem begs to be spoken aloud for the way that it feels in your mouth, and the way that it sounds in your ear, and the way that it also then is able to connect with an audience. But it also has to have all those things on the page. You know, even if it's never being spoken aloud, those things breathe a life and an energy into how those words are read to a person. And so if one is concentrating on giving the important work to how a poem is structured, even if it's never being spoken aloud, you know, that's going to reflect when it does become spoken aloud. So the first thing is always make sure that you're writing as good of a poem as you can write. 2, picking the right poem. A poem should be a well-written one, as I mentioned. It should also be a poem that excites you, a poem that you are so excited to share to people, a poem that you are so excited to say out loud, to feel in your body. And it should also be a poem that people are able to absorb live, through their ears, through their eyes. There's plenty of poems that once I had finished writing them and felt that they were finished, I was so excited to share them with people, and then when I would, for whatever reason, there was a disconnect. There wasn't a click that came into place that allowed my audience to soak them in. And so it's really important to see where those 3 things intersect, where you have the well-written poem intersecting with the poem that excites you, and that also happens to be a poem where people can hear it. So make sure that those 3 things are working together when you're selecting whatever poem it is that you want to perform. The third thing I wanted to speak to right now is an invitation to listen. We sometimes really get caught up in how we're trying to communicate things to others, because that's what communication is a tool for others to understand what we're sharing with them, and vice versa. But poetry also allows itself to be used in different ways. While we also want to communicate certain ideas or feelings that are inside of us, it also is an opportunity to recognize that not everything inside of us is going to be fully understood by another. So it's not necessarily about them understanding so much as them getting an impression. And I find that the best way to allow for that to happen is to not try to force or require my audience to understand what I want to say to them, but rather inviting them to sit and listen. If you're providing a space where an audience wants to hear what you have to say, so much of your work is already done. And it's kind of almost irrelevant how much of what you are communicating is fully understood and comprehended by your audience. They're happy and excited enough to be sitting there in a space with this invitation from you to participate in what you have to give to them. 4, let the poem be your guide. Let the poem be your guide. The poems we write, though it's important for us to have ownership of them, I think it's also important to recognize that they're not ours. We provide the vessel for those poems, for those thoughts, for those things and ideas to make themselves known. And in return, we receive a vessel in which we are able to carry ourselves and introduce part of ourself to our own self or to others. And so it's a partnership as opposed to here's this thing that I made. And that happens in the writing process, but it also happens in the performative aspect if one is performing a poem. And I think that very often that can be something that is overlooked or not recognized or dismissed. I know when I was younger, a lot of the poems that I was writing, I felt like they were attempts at me being very sincere and genuine to my readers or my audience. But then when I would perform them, it felt as if they were being wrapped up in some strange, non-genuine performance. That I was still me on stage, but not as natural as I wanted to be. And it felt very much, I would always say to folks, as if I'd like taken the time to make something to give to somebody, like a wood carving, and then I took that like jumbly, clumsy wood carving and set it into this ornate gilded box with this beautiful diamond encrusted gift wrap to hand to somebody, and those two things just didn't connect. And so I wanted to start seeing what are the ways in which that the poem can show me how it best wants to be given to other people. And when we invite that into the process, it becomes a lot more of an organic experience and a lot more of a true experience, because we're not trying to force and box whatever it is that we've made into a preconceived idea, hope, or expectation of what we have for it. Instead, talking to the poem, sitting with the poem, letting the poem reveal to you how it desires to be shared with others. Because as I said before, it's definitely a partnership. Last thing I wanted to speak to is the audience is your collaborator. And for me, this is one of the most special and most important aspects of performance for me. There's a number of reasons why I love reading poems out loud and reading poems out loud to people. But one of the largest is that it becomes more than just me, and it becomes something that I get to relinquish control of. And I think it's such a beautiful and fascinating thing to be able to take something that I quote-unquote finished, that I made, and set it into a space and then have a conversation through it with a bunch of people who I may or may not know. And for that period in time and space, me and whoever's in that room are using this object that I carried into the space to create something completely new, something that I myself could never comprehend of doing, and that it only exists in that time and space. And so I welcome people to remember that, that the performance can't exist without the audience. We can perform all we want in the privacy of our room, but it becomes something very, very different and something more human and something more vulnerable when we present something that doesn't box off the audience from being an active participant in it. And so for me, that's the biggest thing that I try to invite others to hold on to when they set out to perform their poems. Before I let you go, I just wanted to go over a few little tidbits of kind of more technical type stuff. The first being memorization. For many of us, memorization seems like a very daunting task, but I think also for many of us, our relationship to memorization is one that's rooted in a school assignment. A school assignment to memorize something that we may or may not care about. And so it's a lot different when we're setting about to memorize something that we've written and something that we do care about. It becomes that much easier. For me, part of the memorization process starts separate of the performance, and is rooted in the writing aspect. As I mentioned before, the well-written poem, when you concentrate on that, it allows a lot of the work to already be done. And this is a very specific example for that. For me, hearing the poem out loud allows me to shape and write the poem in a more successful manner. Hearing the sounds, hearing the rhythm, hearing the balance. And so by the time a poem is finished, and if it's a poem that I want to perform, very often it's a poem that a lot of it is already in my head, already in my body, and I just need to continue in that direction. And how I tend to go about doing that is I'll start at the top and I'll memorize a couple lines, and then I'll memorize the next couple lines, and then I'll do them together, and I'll run them together until those 4 lines are memorized, and then I'll add a couple more, memorize those, and see if I can memorize all 6 together, and keep building the poem that way. And I take note that if ever there's a part, either in that memorization process or later in performances, that I continuously have trouble with, then that kind of pushes me to revisit the bones of the poem and see if maybe this should be done differently. If I'm stumbling this much over this part of memorization, perhaps this is not how the poem should sound or be written. The next thing is to follow your body. I'm a big believer in navigating the world through my brain, my heart, and my body. And when I write, my brain and my heart are doing a lot of collaboration. When I perform, that's the opportunity for my body to be part of that. And so I invite it to do such. Nothing I do on stage is choreographed. There's definitely things that, ways in which my body has responded over the years to certain poems that it's responded that way enough that it's become part of that performance. But never do I sit down and say, like, all right, during this part of the poem, it'd be great if I scratched my head. Or during this part of the poem, if I went like this. Anything that I do, any dance on stage, comes from allowing my body to participate in that collaborative process. So I put before you that if there's an itch, a tingle somewhere in your shoulder, your wrist, your eyebrows, to respond and play with the words that you're saying out loud, to let that happen and see where it goes, where it leads you. 3, experimenting reveals new relationships. It can become very easy to start doing our poems in the same manner that we've always done them. I found out what works, so this is how it's going to be. This is how I want it to be. This is how I want it to sound. This is how I want it to look. And we just do that and do that and do that. But if we put before ourselves to try something different just for doing something different, that might reveal aspects of that poem that before that moment were unknown to us. So I'm a big believer in, say, like whispering a whole poem, yelling a poem into a hat, doing a poem in a silly voice, doing a poem with my arms over my head the whole time. Go into a closet filled with jackets and shut the door and turn off the light and do your poem. Do your poem while you're like unable to like bend your elbows, just like doing any of these things or whatever, really will start pushing and stretching your brain and your body and your heart to kind of like reinvestigate what are the ways that this poem wants to be shared and what new ways can I explore it and play with it. Next, when you step onto stage, when you step up to a microphone, if that's the situation, but regardless, wherever it is that you are positioning yourself to speak, find your spot, claim it, and take it. That's not to say that you don't have to move from that spot, but having that anchor, roots yourself, and it also roots the audience in that, oh, something is about to happen. Next, I always like to connect with the audience before I say anything. And I think that, when we are doing, particularly when we're doing individual poems on a stage before an audience, that it again further signifies to them that something is about to happen. And it also establishes that, like, me as a performer, I see you as an audience, and I want whatever is going to happen between us to be allowed to happen. So for me, I always like to take a moment, look at the audience, and smile at them. Find whatever works for you. Next, make sure you're speaking into the microphone. If the microphone's here, and it's only amplifying to this, and you're talking over here, if you're talking over here, if you're talking like this, no one's going to hear you. The microphone does its job, but it's not this magical amplification tool. Which leads me to the next thing. Regardless of microphone or not, always speak up. The poem that can't be heard, can't be heard. It doesn't matter how good it is. So speak up, speak clearly, even when there's a microphone. And the last thing is the performance is not just the product. The performance is the process. The performance is the practice. We sometimes, I think, put a lot of pressure on ourselves when we get into a performative space, that this has to be perfect, that this has to be polished, that this has to be the way it's going to be for always. But every time we do a poem in practice, on our own, with our friends, with our Poetry Slam teammates, when we practice, that's just in those spaces. And that's very, very different than when we are doing it as an offering to other people, to strangers, to loved ones, to a room full of people. And so we can't practice for that until we're actually doing it. But even though that at times feels perhaps scary, that's also a really huge opportunity to see, oh, every time I do this poem, I get the chance to learn something new about it, new about myself, new about my relationship to the poem. And so if that comes before us, then every time we do the poem, regardless of whether or not we think it's done, it's always going to be a little bit fresh, a little bit new. And there's always going to be new mysteries to unfold from that. So thank you so much for joining me for this. Hope you got something from it. And hope I'll see you sooner than later.